Hey everybody, welcome back to another Sandler webinar. This one is in our series of how to succeed in the current climate. We're talking about working remotely, selling remotely, what to do and sell in uncertainty. And this session today is about how to succeed at building a virtual training program for your team. Maybe you're in a large corporation and you weren't planning on having everybody do their training remotely on their own from home. Maybe you have just started this and you said, hey, all my people have some time to do some learning. I need to come up and make up a training program really quick. And we have one of our experts from across the pond. He is over in Switzerland right now. I'm in Kansas City and in the United States. So we're both working from home remotely. And Bill, you have a PhD here. You have written papers on this, and you're one of our international trainers that help us design virtual training programs for dispersed teams around the world, right? Anything you'd add?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think first and foremost, my biggest qualification is I'm a sales guy. So yes, I've done some academic work in this, but I spent my whole life in sales or being a sales leader. And I know what it's like when you're training, when you've got a team to motivate, and I've been through one or two dips in markets and one or two crises too. And you know, my academic life and my Santa training life and my sales life kind of come together a little bit, I hope.
Yeah, and same thing for me. I've done, speaking and training my whole life, and I've worked as a freelancer in the gig economy most of my career. So I'm happy to work for Sandler Corporate internationally now as a full-time gig. But really, I've been working home and working remotely, and Sandler has been doing this for a long time. So we've been doing online learning for about 10 years. We've been doing a ton of virtual training. You see on the screen, we train over 30,000 people a year. Half of our staff is remote because we train in like 29 different countries. So we were already prepared doing virtual training, and with half of our workforce already dispersed, prepare our learning to be able to be delivered to people wherever they are. And part of that and our upfront contracts here as we get started is there's a couple of notes for you here in this session. The first one is we understand here at Sandler the learning process. And so what we're going to do today is try to give you as much awareness of some things that you can do in putting together a virtual training program as possible. We'll give you as much knowledge as we can cram in the next hour. We don't have time to practice any of these skills with you, especially with thousands of you on here remotely. So we're not going to get hands-on skill, and certainly we can't make you a Jedi master of virtual training by hearing us talk about it for an hour. So I want to challenge you to take these things, write them down, take lots of notes, and go out and apply them immediately in your workforce, because that's what makes a difference here. But we do also want you to participate in this webinar. So in a few times throughout, I will ask you to type in the chat some of your answers and share your thoughts here. But if you have any questions that we can't answer today, talk to your local Sandler trainer. If you go to sandler.com/remote selling, we have a few special offers on this webinar. There's also information where you can contact a trainer in your country, often your city as well. We have over 250 locations around the world. And at that link, sandler.com/remote selling, are some special offers around micro learning, mobile apps that you can use to help you do your virtual training. Now, Bill, as we jump into this, I think we should probably talk about the current situation that we are all in. And the first thing I think that's important is that this crisis is temporary. You see the graphs on there from 2001 in the United States and 2009 in our housing crash. They both bounced back, right? And so will everybody around the world in this situation. But I think that in these times, we happen to be at the bottom of those troughs as we're doing this webinar today. So what do you think? I think for me, there's two things. There's one is like that grieving process. A lot of people were in denial for a long time. Oh, this isn't going to be a thing. It's not affecting me. There's only 15 people in the United States that have the disease or whatever. To like depression, anxiety, bargaining, and trying to figure out how they can still go to work. To hopefully now some sort of acceptance and some semblance of reality. But there's also that like fight, flight, and freeze mechanisms that are triggered in all of us. So What comes to mind, Bill, for you of where you think people are at the moment and maybe where they need to be?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I always like to look at charts. I'm a big charts and data guy, but here's the first bit of data. Most people think there was before the crisis and the crisis. In fact, that's a fundamentally wrong way to think. Here's what I look. We've got to look at this as a period of dramatic disruption, and it's in 3 phases, not 2. There was the world before the problem. There's the problem and the world after. And one thing we know, what all these charts will show you, is the world that happens after this particular crisis will not be exactly the same as the world before. And what we've got to do is not to get ourselves to go back in time to 2019, but get ourselves ready for the rest of 2020 and in 2021. So we've got to be thinking, what is the new normal? And what do I do now to get me and my team ready for the new normal? So it's 3 phases I'm thinking about right now. How do I cope with what's going on? And I am a sales leader. I'm still a sales leader, and most of the people listening to this are leaders of people. What do I do right now to keep my people, to keep my client base working? How do I train my people? And how do I get myself ready for the upturn? Because it's not going to be the same as what happened in the past.
Well, I love that because it ties right into what we're talking about today, and you hit these 3 buckets too for us. So I think the tips from Sandler to you are think about for yourself and your people how these 3 success triangles tie together, and they either spiral upwards or they spiral downwards. So if your people have a terrible attitude and they're freaking out and panicking, they're going to stop doing the right things. They're going to have poor behavior, which also leads to sloppy technique because they think, oh, whatever I'm going to do isn't going to work. I can't sell anything in this climate. So why should I even try? And they start making themselves worse. And then they don't get results. So then their attitude gets worse and it spirals down. The opposite is also true. If you can adjust to this, cope with it, increase your attitude, increase and change your behaviors to fit that plan that you were talking about, Bill, and then work on new techniques. I love what you said about the new normal. I think this situation, especially for virtual training, is going to spur innovation that would have taken 20 years. Now it's going to take 2 months, and people are going to adjust to online learning and virtual training, live instructor-led virtual like this, where it may have taken your company years to adjust to that. Now it's weeks or months that you can spur innovation and get to the other side of that trough more quickly. Would you agree?
Oh, I think so. It's very true. I mean, usually when you have a crisis, all the crisis does is spurs the rate of increase, you know, so change gets faster and faster and faster. And if I look at the triangle thing you've got here with behavior, attitude, technique, to think about remote training now is extremely important because I'm spending almost all my time with sales teams, international sales teams, talking about adopting new techniques and talking about behavior, but you've also got to train attitude. So as we're talking about training, we've got to come from a foundation, an intellectual and emotional foundation, which means attitude. So we've got to say, what attitude am I trying to train into my team? And here's the attitude right now. In a time of crisis, there are 3 possible sources for a plan. Either the customer has a plan. And right now, when things are going pretty bad, or the customer's plan is, I want everything free yesterday, stop everything. So they're responding to their agenda, and I understand their agenda because that's all they're seeing. So they've got their to-do list. Things are bad about where they are, and that's their agenda. And that's one plan. You can do everything the customer wants. That's one attitude. The other attitude is you have no plan at all. And no plan at all is everyone does nothing, and that's happening. All around the world, phones are not ringing, emails are not being answered out there, so there's no plan at all. And the third plan is having an attitude that you and your sales team own the relationship. You own the relationship and you've got to make stuff happen. And because you own the relationship, you've got to have behaviors and techniques that you can put in place and train during a time of crisis to make sure things go. So you start with attitude, and the attitude is, this is our job.
I love that. So let's dive into it and talk about your job. This is where I want you to participate. If you're on the line right now, type in the chat, what's one thing that you're struggling with in virtual training? Just type those into the chat. We'll take a look at some of these and see if we can address them as we go along. But also, Bill, I want to ask you while they're doing that, what are some things you think even before the crisis that people were getting wrong about virtual training? And maybe what are some of the ideal attitudes, behaviors, and techniques that we can get right when talking about training. So let's start with the wrong. What do you think people typically make mistakes on?
Okay, I think the biggest mistake is that people forget that remote training is quite a complex thing. And remote education and remote training are not the same thing. So remote education is you go and buy something for $25 on LinkedIn or something, and that's fine. It can teach you some nice basic stuff, but that's educational. We are not in the education business, and we're not discussing education in here. What we're talking about is productive change, behavioral change. So we've got to make sure we understand those two things. I'm currently learning a new software system, and that's a great deal of fun for me, but that's a technical learning thing that I'm doing. We're not in that space. So very often, people confuse remote education with remote training. Those two are not the same thing. Because I will, at the end of this very interesting software training program I'm going through right now, I will be able to run this software. I know I will. It's a set of pretty dry, cold, technical skills. We all live in the world of sales. And right now, we live in the world of sales in crisis. So that means we've got to push ourselves beyond what we know to what we do. And people forget that in remote training.
Oh, I think you nailed it. When I see people make mistakes, they're talking about information delivery, that you can record a video and send it out to your team, or a press release or whatever, and get talk tracks out to your team. But that's not changing behavior. We're talking about training that is looking for the other person to do something, not the information you're trying to dispense and put into their head. And I know you have some great practices for this. So let's talk about these 5 essential elements of doing it correctly.
Sure, and let me explain why we know a little bit about this. I mean, I do work with a number of business schools, so we've addressed this topic quite academically. But more than that, I'm talking to you from Switzerland, and despite my quaint Scottish accent, I'm not Swiss. I mean, we came here. Switzerland's a small country, very multinational. And if we train a team of 10 people, they're very rarely based here. So we have a head office here with 2 guys from Germany, a couple of guys from France. So we tend to do a little bit of training face to face, and then people disperse. So we're very used to the world of remote learning, and which is pretty good news for Sandler in lots of ways, because we were the founders, one of the earliest proponents of remote learning. We've always done it. In fact, if you listen to the old archive footage of Mr. David Sandler talking, you hear him talking this all the time. If you don't reinforce, you're wasting your time. In fact, you showed a book in one of the earlier slides, the first book that I read about Sandler, and most of us did, and I would recommend it to anyone in the world of sales and sales leadership. You can't teach a kid to ride a bike in a seminar. So although we are talking about 21st century learning, we are fundamentally talking the same script as David Sandler did way back in the 70s and 80s of the last century. So we've always been very much into remote learning and reinforcement learning. And the 5 things we've got here are based quite a lot on the best thinking academically, but also on our experience here in Europe, where we always train remotely. And if you like, I'll maybe explain 1 or 2 of these little things.
You bet.
Okay, so the first one in here, and it comes to a challenge that we often get in training, and they'll say, well, what's your ROI? What's your return on investment? If I give you X amount of dollars to train my guys, what's my payback? So we get this all the time. And here's the answer to that. We'll say, well, what are you trying to achieve? The first thing we have to do, if you're training a team, is not to make the team smarter. Send them to night school for that. Buy them a training course. Like, no. What we're trying to do is achieve a goal. Now, a goal of any organization comes from some form of executive inside the company. So the first thing we're always going to say is, give us a goal to go for, and let us make sure this goal that we are trying to achieve is relevant to the strategic future of the company. So a classic thing that we'll do when it comes to remote learning for a corporate training team is to say, who's the sponsor? Who cares? What problem are we solving for the senior leadership of the organization? So a typical thing will be, when we launch a training program, we'll be to have a senior level of the executive team say, this is what this program is for. I'll give you a few examples. We are not here to do training. We are here because our last 3 product launches all failed, and we can't fail number 4. We've always failed to have a sales price increase that achieves our objectives. That's a classic one that we get in here. Our negotiations take too long and we're losing margin. We're giving too much discount. We're failing to position our person, get the value we earn. So we need a sponsor to give us a goal. So we love that, because if you give us a goal, we might hit it. If you don't give us a goal, then we'll make them smarter. But who really cares about making them all smarter? That's what school is for. So we're not so good with that. So we need sponsorship, and we need a great KPI to go for. I'll tell you my favorite KPI we had in the last 18 months. And when we heard it from one client, we've taken it to other clients. We've had clients say to us, Bill, we want to change your behavior as a team of people to grow our gross margin. And I'm like, okay, well, what's your gross margin now? Give us the data to work to.
Oh, yeah.
And the first one that we worked to, it was a manufacturing organization with relatively thin margins. They made big industrial things. We put 3 points on their gross margin. Now, the impact of that was we tripled their profit. Can you imagine that? That's tripling somebody's profit by putting 3 points in GM, by making sure their sales guys behave differently. And we were given complete credit for that. So we love a goal like that. So sponsorship is vital. Now, I know that some people listening to this little communication may not be a sales leader, may not be doing large-scale training. That's okay. If you're trying to organize training for yourself remotely, well, what are you trying to do? What are your KPIs? Now, one of my KPIs when I first started in Sandler Sales about 11 years ago, I wanted to have my conversion rate, meetings to contracts. That's a great one. Now, if you're not running a team, or if you want your own KPI to go, you've got to sponsor yourself. And sponsorship and KPIs, key performance indicators, go hand in hand. So that's the first thing you've got to do. All clear with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we should hit all 5 of these, because I think they can probably guess. So, participative is pretty easy, but a lot of people get that wrong. So, we can have you chat here on this one. Unfortunately, there's a couple thousand people on the line. We can't do it really interactive. And if you're watching this recording in Sandler Online later, it's really even harder for us to get your reactions. But when you're planning a training like this, you need to plan on them engaging, because one-way communication is not training, like we've already mentioned, right? Any other thoughts?
That's so true. It's so true. It's a very, very, very old form of training, and it says never teach anyone anything they can learn by themselves. And I think, well, that's pretty good. That was good enough for Plato, who's the first guy to write that one down, by the way. That was good enough for him, and him and Socrates both said the same thing, I guess. If that's good enough for them and it's lasted 2,500 years, it's probably true. So you've got to lead people to help solve the problem by themselves. So in lots of ways, training and facilitation are almost the same thing. You're heading towards a goal. So participation is critical. We're all past the time of sitting in a classroom.
So what do you mean by implemented then? How is that different?
It's great. I'll tell you what implemented means. If you don't do it, there's no point in learning it. That's the world that we're in. I'll give you a great point in here of implementation. A fundamental part of Sandler's belief is that salespeople exist and sales teams exist to help their clients solve pains, and we get paid well for doing that. We solve pain profitably. That's what we're all about. And I think that's a basic Sandler tenet. And I think my experience as a salesperson is that's true. Now, to do that, you've got to know how to uncover the pain of the other side, logically. And that means you've got to stop talking about your product and your service and change direction and train your people in the techniques and behaviors of how to uncover the pain of the other side, which sounds so easy. And many years ago, when I read that, I went, well, that's pretty easy. And that's obvious. 2 things that everyone thinks and everyone's always wrong. So you've got to take it out of a book, off the webinar, out of the discussion group, and actually implement it, which is why we say program, not training event. We don't really like training events. We're big fans of training programs. So you've got to implement it. And that means, I don't know about you, the first time I tried something, I wasn't very good at it. When I got my driver's permit, my driver's license, you know what? I thought I could drive. No. I couldn't drive for many years until after that. And I had a few bumps and scrapes to show it. It's the implementation that matters. So when you are doing remote learning, not remote training, get it? The implementation is there. So you've got to make sure you try it. You've got to make sure you and your team are pushed outside your comfort zone, and you've got to be supported during that implementation phase.
And I already mentioned that we're archiving this webinar, but there's a lot more to that because you also mentioned earlier reinforcement. And I think when I'm developing, content here, because I'm the global head of content at Sandler and develop a lot of our programs, we have to think that there are a lot of different types of learners. So while we may have some live interactions, we probably also have some reading, some videos to watch, some audio podcasts for when salespeople around the world are on planes or things where they can't do live learning. Any other thoughts on how you best use multimedia and archive content to supplement that
Yeah,
live training?
sure. And one thing I think about archive, by the way, is that all learners are different. And some learners will go really deep into, for example, pain discovery, or some leaders will go really into the idea of what we call the upfront contract, which to me is like the basis of being a sales project manager for your clients. It's great things to do. Now, in everything, we believe there's levels of ability to implement these things. And typically what an archive does is it's got your basics, but it's also got more in-depth learning that we can do. And if you want to learn more, you've got to give learners a path. So that's why an archive makes a ton of sense. Now, on the archive thing, the best form of training in the whole world is face-to-face. It's so powerful. If you can't do face-to-face, then you're obviously going to do remote. But people want to access data at their own pace. Some people are Sunday morning students. Some people are nighthawks. Some people learn in 5 or 6 minute slices. Some people learn in 2 hour slices. You don't know. So you've got to give people the choice. And all the evidence shows that self-paced study is a very powerful way. That's what the archive is for.
I love that, and I think it takes us right to our last one here, deliverable, which is you have to be collecting best practices and archiving this so you don't have to teach the same training from scratch every single time. So you need to be archiving what you're teaching, but also what they need to be learning. And I love what you said too. 2020 here, modern learning environment, everybody is starting at a different spot. It doesn't make sense to get everybody together in a classroom and start everybody on page 1. Some people are already on page 30. Some people haven't even gotten the book yet, right? And so how can we give them a chance to either catch up to the group or run ahead if they want to and learn at their own speed and learn the topics that they want? I love that adaptive learning. It's great.
No, it's a very, very powerful thing. And if you think about how you've learned yourself, I mean, as I say, I'm learning this great fun experience of learning a new software system. And there are certain things I've read 5 or 6 times and I still don't understand them. In the classroom, once it's been done once, I can't, have a bit of a problem with that. So that's why the archive is good. But I want to spend a minute talking about the deliverable, because very often when I say you've got to have a KPI, well, that's good. If the KPI is a sales price increase or whatever your KPI, nice to measure. I'll tell you one KPI that I saw that I loved. One of our clients, they had 4 business units and they worked in 6 different global regions, okay? 24 different entities. Guess what? All 24 different entities had different priorities, different this, different that, different ways of working. And the CEO said, so tell me, what's happening in our top accounts, okay? And he got a wild babbling chorus of different answers, none of which made sense. And he was obviously a bit frustrated because their top bunch of accounts made up 25% of their revenue. So that's a concern. So his deliverable was, he said, look, I want some sense out of this chaos. And not only that, I want to get us to be in the driving seat, because right now I've got 24 different entities who all seem to be doing the best to keep the customer happy, but nobody's trying to lead the customer to find more value. I'm not so happy with that. So his deliverable was very simple. He wanted an account plan, an active growth plan for every single one of their account plans. So what we did in that particular remote learning program was we started with the sponsorship, which came from the CEO, which always helps, went right through a 90-day program. And at the end of that, the deliverable was an evaluated presentation by the C-suite, who sat and read all 14 global growth plans, picked 3 and called those 3 teams in to present to the C-level of the organization. That was one of the fundamentally most powerful days that company's had in years.
Yeah, that's huge. And I think you're right. If we don't have an outcome, we don't have a way to measure it and a way like that to present, here's what we did, here's what we accomplished, then really we're just kind of spinning our wheels a little bit. We're doing good things, we're helping people, making them feel better, but there's no way to prove that to boss or manager, especially in this time period where they might be thinking about cutting budgets or looking for places to trim. We don't want to say, oh, this is something that feels good but doesn't impact ROI. We want to have proof that we can take to the CEO and say, hey, here's how we, tripled your profits through this training program that we put together, right?
Exactly, and we have that. Now, we spent an awful lot of time looking at how this is working. The idea of having learning threads is not our idea. It's a very well-established academic thing of a learning thread. What I think we've brought to it is that because of our, I would say, pretty much unique position as an organization, that we have a huge depth of learning. At the same time as that, we are unbelievably close to our clients. So we've created this thing, say, Sander, of the work-aligned learning thread. And that means we take learning, but make it strictly aligned to the key objectives of an organization. So we call it a WALT, work-aligned learning thread. And we find that the power of this is so great that it gets the entire organization aligned and targeted around some new behaviors.
So a lot of people might be new to the word learning thread. If we have some L&D people on here, they might have heard that by now, but I see these bullets here. You want to tell us a little bit more about what this is, and then we'll go into some of the steps and show an example for everybody. But what does really that mean for us?
Yeah, let me just talk through learning thread. I think what a thread is. Now, if you go back 25, 30 years ago, almost all training was event-based. You got a bunch of people in a room, and all these people, then someone would stand up and give them some PowerPoint slides, and then anyone who was still awake at the end did a little exam, and everyone went home. That was an event. And I again remember back to when I learned my Sander, listening to the audios of David Sander going crazy over that, because it simply doesn't work. We've always been a learning thread organization, even before they're called learning threads. Now, a thread is not an event. It goes all the way through. It's a continuous element, and it goes in a direction in here. So the idea of a learning thread is it's additive, it goes on, and it can be woven into other things. So a learning thread is a very well-known thing in the world of L&D, and we should all be thinking, if someone's ever saying, I want to train my people, and you say, well, what does the thread look like? Where's the beginning? Where's the middle? Where's the end? What does this thing look like? Because it's never an event. And if you're ever thinking, I want to have an event, well, that event might be motivational, it might be interesting. The chance of that turning to new business behavior is not high. So if you want, I'll just talk through these points.
Well, I was going to ask, I guess the other side of that is the work aligned part, right? Which is another modern L&D thing that people talk about a lot, which is like job skills, on the job training. We know, we've heard the models of, how much of your learning occurs on the job versus in the classroom or in self-study. And I'm assuming this is stuff that you would apply in your job, not just in case information, things that are nice to know, but you might not ever use, but applicable just-in-time information that you're going to use like when you go out to actually do your job, right?
Well, let's go back and look for some. I always say, well, who says so? What's the proof of that? Okay, well, let's look at some evidence in here. Here's two. There's a big event held over here in Switzerland every year, a place called Davos, which is called the World Economic Forum. And what happens there is all the smartest guys and smartest ladies in the world come together and have a lot of conversations, and then people took surveys of what they say, and their opinion really matters. And you're talking about the chairman of Google, the CEO of Microsoft. There's a lot of big hitters come along to this thing. So when they say, here's what I think the future looks like, you should kind of listen to what they say. Here's one thing they say. They do a thing, and they'll say about skills durability, So you go back 100 years and you made horseshoes or crankshafts in a factory in Detroit or something, right? You would start a job doing that, and 35 years later, if you were still alive, you were still doing the same job with the same skills that were in here. Now, over 40% of all skills are non-durable. That means the skills you have now in 5 years' time, 40% of them, that's actually 42, will not still be of any value to you. That's a big thing. That means you've got to constantly go out and refresh your skills in here. And that's going to be work-based. Now, if you go back to a very, very old way of looking at training, it's a rule called the 70-20-10 rule. And that means that 10% of anything you learn comes from your primary source. You go to a training program, you read a book. 20% comes from how you interact with that. 70% comes from implementation. You don't learn how to drive until after you get your permit. Same thing in here. So that's kind of what so much of this is about when it comes to the need for work-aligned learning threads. And if I just like look at these 3 points in here, if you don't have a goal, what's your motivation? I mean, seriously, what is your motivation? The amount of times that, I mean, when I did my first ever training programs and things like, oh, health and safety and things, and you go, oh, wow, I've got to go do this training program. You sit through the presentation, as soon as you can, you leave and forget everything you learned in here. Because the goal was never very clearly stated. What we want to do is align ourselves with people who are trying to achieve a business goal and say, we can help you. We've got something to bring here. We are world-class facilitators. We are the world leaders in sales training. We can help your people on their path. So give us a project-based business objective. And if you do that, 1, your business objective is highly likely to be achieved. 2, all the stuff we train those people, they will actually implement these things. Now, that takes to point number 2, which you've got to be aware. We're trying to get people to do new things. That means they have to go outside their comfort zone. Logically, that means they're going to be at points where they're being uncomfortable. And I'll give you a real example of that. I've got so many people, and I'll meet the sales team for the first time. And I have a preference. I work a lot with very technical organizations. I like complexity. I like complex products. And I'll say, so what do you do? And I'll get a barrage of technical information coming back. And I'll go, oh, that's really dull. What do you tell me that guy? Because they're very, very product. And I'll go, I understand why you do that. My job is to stop you answering that question that way and start thinking about the pains you solve for other organizations. So you've got to make people be uncomfortable. There's an ethical element of that. If you're saying to someone, stop doing what you've been doing successfully for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years and do this other thing, start being a problem solver, not a product promoter, that's difficult. So you've got to help them as they're doing these new techniques and applying them in the field. You've got to recognize, you've got to support these people, and you've got to help them apply those things. So that's the thing. You've got to, and there's a big thing in here. That's why there's so many sales books out there that have no actual impact on people, because nobody helps you overcome these challenges and you try to implement them. And I could talk all day about that because it's such a passionate thing for me. And the last thing in here is, if you go out there and you work really hard and you push aside outside your comfort zone, I want more than a certificate and maybe a t-shirt. I want something from that. And I want to be in the people who we train for EMEA, Europe, Middle East and Africa team, and the people we train here in Switzerland. They will tell you, we're the guys that created the new sales price increase policy. We're the guys that created the new negotiating planning system. That's what our people will say. Clear, measurable, deliverable.
Oh, I think that's amazing. And I think, since we're in sales, this, webinar isn't necessarily designed at salespeople. It can be used for any type of training you're creating. But for salespeople, you nailed it. I mean, if we can help you earn more money, get more for your department, solidify your job because you're impacting revenues, that's huge. And I wanted to throw back, before we talk about an example here, to what you said about durable skills. I was thinking that the other day in this crisis and this economy, and I think even just at this point in humanity, that sales skills are one of the most durable skills on the planet. That if you can prospect, go out and talk to strangers about their interest in accomplishing something, deal with the rejection of the people who are not ready, and move forward predictably the people who are ready to take action on that, I don't see that going away with any sort of automation technology, disruption that would happen in the market, right?
And I'm a great man for data. I always go, okay, what's the evidence for that? So here's some evidence for you. I mentioned earlier on the World Economic Forum, an organization I have a huge amount of respect for. They have a thing, and it's called Skills. And they had Skills 2025, and they're now doing Skills 30. So they say, here's what will be in 10 years' time. Now, remember who these people are. They are the CEOs and presidents and CEOs of the world's largest organizations. So their opinion really counts. Skills 2030, love this one, right? Skills 2030 says, if you look at the top 10 skills required for success in 10 years' time, 1 is technical, 1 is a hard skill, 9 are soft skills. it's influencing, it's communication, it's leadership, it's understanding the others. 9 out of 10 skills that you, whoever's listening to this, will need in 10 years' time are soft skills. And all the stuff we talk about in sales is nothing more than the application of soft skills for a commercial objective. We are a soft skills training program that focuses very much on sales. David Sadler himself said this, we happen to be sales guys, but we are all about behavioral change and influencing skills.
All right, so let's dig into it. And I know people, if they've stuck with us this far, they're ready to know, how do we actually do this? Put one of these plans together. You're going to walk us through one of the typical examples of something that you might put together for a team. And then we also have 5 tips of things you need to talk about in order to put together a work-aligned learning thread for your team or yourself. So you want to talk about this Walt example you put together for us, and maybe how this would work if we're trying to implement a new training program for our sales team?
Sure, and your learning program. So this is a very real example. In fact, what we did when we were putting all this together, we says, well, let's look at what's working. So we pulled together all of our programs, we pulled all the commonalities of them. And the 7-stage process that you see in here, we've had some that were a lot more than 7, but none less. So if you look, you've got to have, when we try to do it less, we weren't supporting the people enough. So you've got to think, we kind of want this, and you want 2 clear bites at the cherry, review 1 and review 2. Some of these things we've discussed already. First thing, now this is Imagine. Now remember this is all virtual, all remote. This is no face-to-face, and we do these. We know these work. We have that practical experience. Here's what we do. Number 1, you got to have that kickoff call. The kickoff call has got to say, here's why we're doing this. Here's the goals and objectives. Here's the voice of a senior executive of this organization telling you why this is strategically important. The senior sponsor passes that then across to 2 people, the operational leader from within the company and the facilitator trainer. That's our team. So the kickoff call is this little magic triangle: senior leadership, operational leadership, the Sandler people. And that's an hour. It's fast, it's powerful. Here's what we're going to do. And it's pretty much one way, right? So it's a blast at the people. So once we've done that, that's cool. Immediately after that, the work starts. You then, I mentioned the archive. You're then sending stuff out to pre-warn, to get people thinking. Now, the pre-work and briefing takes a few weeks. Now, what we'll do in here, we'll very often do little custom videos, because the technology is such now you can make a video like that. So the custom videos, a bit of pre-reading. And here's the thing. For example, say we're doing negotiating for better deals. We'll give a base level, but for those who want to do more, we'll do more complex white papers, further reading, and other leads they can go to. So straight away, here's what you need to know. Here's what you may want to know. That's your archiving in operation straight away. We're also going to give them pre-work. So say, for example, an organization says, we've got to find growth from our top 25 accounts. Very real example. What the first thing we'll do is we'll give them pre-work. And one of the best things to do in pre-work is to do a really nice, solid SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis. Great starting point. We should all know how to do those things. We send out those blanks with a bit of video briefing, get people working straight away. Get them thinking strategically. So we have 2 weeks of them beginning to engage, align towards that strategic goal. Now what we do, once that's over, is and all the way through this, we're engaged. We're getting stuff, we're getting calls, we're reviewing pre-work. Team call 1. Now remember, this is for one team. Very often we'll have a big group and then split into different teams, but I'm just working for the basis of just this one team here. Team call 1. At this point, you're then going to start going through their specific objectives, being really focused on the objectives. You've done some pre-work, we've got some stuff coming in. By the way, at this point, you know who's doing what in the teams. The teams start to self-identify, so that helps you quite a lot too. But in team call 1, you say, here's the expectation, here's what we want from you, here's our timelines, 1, 2, 3. We do all that kind of stuff, and you really set them some serious homework. Now, at this point, you're nearly always giving them some actual training. Actual training. You're saying, do this thing. And you're nearly always going to say, try this, here's a technique you've got to use. A classic one that we'll do is the simplest thing in the world. There's a Sandler concept called bonding and rapport. And that means finding out more about the other person and positioning yourself in a different way rather than just being the technical sales guy. So we'll give them pre-work to do. We'll nearly always give them remote learning videos, part of what you mentioned, Standard Online, which I think is the world's largest online sales archive. We'll give them stuff like that to do. And I've got I've got a couple of weeks in here, in fact, 4 weeks in here. Now they're implementing. They're doing the work. And if I'd imagine 2 very real examples, because you can include anything else, you're going to have bonding rapport, an upfront contract, and maybe some pain discovery. And you're pulling it together to try and put it into a kind of structure of the beginning of an account plan. So that takes 4 weeks. That's a lot of phone calls and coaching and support and all that kind of stuff in here. Then at that point, you put it together. Now you have your first review. And this is where you say, this is where we are. Now, in a review, what happens is this isn't us telling them how to do stuff. Remember what I said earlier on, never teach anyone to do something they can learn by themselves. Now, the team is self-teaching. They're talking about the application of the techniques and behaviors they've learned. They're looking at new process. We have this tremendous system called standard enterprise selling. They've taken some of the tools and templates from the enterprise selling system and applied them, and they start to do it. And that's your first review. And the joy of the first review is the gaps you find. You go, okay, well, here's where we are. We don't know that. We don't know that. We don't know that. We haven't tried that. That's great. That's what it's for. Now, once you've done that, you say, okay, this is where we are in terms of that. Now we're going to go through the implementation and team calls too. Then you're moving through and following the same process. A bit more training, a bit more reinforcement, more and more tasks. And again, is there implementation to moving towards having a deliverable. And now you have review 2. Review 2 is where the team comes together and says, well, this is good to go. This is, if you like, almost our final draft of what we want to deliver. And then you go through to the end. Evaluation. How have we done as a team? How have we done? Because that, and it's called extrinsic and intrinsic review. There's 2 things, extrinsic and intrinsic review. Go through the evaluation process. How did we do? And then how did my corporate sponsor from the kickoff call, how did they think we did? And at that point, you have a transformative experience for all the individuals and the organization.
Well, I love all this, obviously, but I think 3 things jumped out to me in here as you were walking through the example. One is the kickoff and the pre-work and briefing is really talking to the team about buying into the training. You said earlier in the webinar that we can't force learning on anybody. We can't just get everybody in the room and say, you're gonna, you're required to do all this, stand here and stare at the screen for the next 30 minutes until you like memorize. That's no way for adults to learn. So we have to have a whole stage there about getting people to buy into the training. Also, I love that you broke it up in the middle about with accountability and check-in. A lot of times I see people say, oh, we're going to do this year-long training program. Here, we'll kick it off, and then we'll talk about the evaluation at the end. But they forgot to check to see if anybody was doing it, making progress and going along. So I know we always use the managers, but also the L&D and training directors to say, like, hey, every week we set out these pre-works. Did anybody do the pre-work? What happened from that? What were their lessons? How did that content work? Was it applicable? Is it something that you can use? Do you need more or less information, and evaluating along the way? And then obviously, part 3 you mentioned there was at the end, summing all this up. Again, I see people go, okay, well, we did the sales kickoff, or we did the boot camp thing, or we launched this product, and then it just kind of fades off into the distance. There's no closure or anybody going back to check and see if we actually accomplished what we were trying to accomplish, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And when it comes to that final evaluation, I've never seen a single evaluation at the very end that did not lead to further action. Because they'll go, oh, that was pretty good. What's next? Because that's what bosses say. That's what bosses are for. And they go, very good, very good. Well, what's next? When you go, do something else clever now. Because that's how you build one on the other.
And that takes us to our next slide here, which is the threaded part is you probably have multiple streams of things. So it's not like, oh, your team is only learning sales. They're probably learning product information, maybe customer service stuff or leadership tactics, or you have other internal compliance training going on. So how do we work all these together and put different threads on top of each other, right?
And I think a big thing in here is in the olden days, when I started my first ever sales job, I worked for a great big chemicals company, a beautiful organization, and we had a big factory and we had a head office, and I was a sales guy. And my job was be out there and doing everything to do with sales was me. and I got a bit of technical help, and that was quite nice. Never spoke to marketing, never spoke to product managers. That didn't happen. They were the enemy, obviously. I think those days are gone or going rapidly. And what you now have is very integrated organizations, and organizations that don't sell products now to sell customer success. And I think that's a very reasonable thing to do. Now, to have customer success, you need to be pretty well aligned. So what you've got in here is a real snapshot of a client who we work with right now, and we train all three teams. So what you say is, you see a sales team, and we sit the corporate leadership and say, what's important for sales success? They say, well, here's three things. This is over 18 months. They must be better at getting a sales price increase because they don't get them when we ask them. They must be more effective in new product launches because we're not hitting the goals we want to. And we've got to find growth in our existing accounts. Now, there's no point in just training the sales guys. It's a waste of time. It seriously is, and it's something as complex as this. What you've got to do is a new product launch, for example, requires all three people. Support and service is the delivery team. And product management designs the products in the first place. So if you don't get all those three parts aligned, all three understand the same language, how to launch it, how to playbook it, how to make it happen, you're going to fail. So we have the threads. So look, there's a little matrix there. You've got the threads and you've got the different teams in here. Of course, we're seeing this in 2 dimensions. But of course, sales price increase, we then move into a 3rd dimension of depth in terms of negotiating skills and strategic visions. So what you're seeing in here is threads and teams. Different teams, sometimes you bring a team in, sometimes you don't. Sales price increase, sales guys have to go and do that. You know, then they're pretty much out there on their own. Right. That's just us to do that kind of stuff in here. Account expansion, you can't have account expansion without involving delivery. That's what
yeah, absolutely. And I love that you talked about depth and other things, because we talked about the adaptive learning. And so, yeah, support and service might not need to be in the price increase discussion, but there is stuff that everybody needs. And I think that's where I get excited as a training director, as somebody putting this as a leader together for other people, is like, how can I get everybody the DISC behavioral style training, because we all need team building and we all need to understand how each other works, but then divide them off into breakouts and groups and other threads to say, hey, you go dive and here's how you apply this in your world. That's, to me, is where it gets really exciting and it gets really applicable for people, and they love the training, rather than saying, oh, everybody goes through the same thing and I'm going to be bored 70% of the time and waiting for that 30% of the time that it's relevant for me. Right?
Yeah, exactly, true. And I think also, I mean, as the world becomes more and more dispersed, very often you've got your product management. They could be in New York, and on Eastern time, you've got sales guys in California, and guess what? Maybe you've got sales guys sometimes even in Europe, you know? So you've got, this is why the remote thing is so important, because you've dispersed organizations and they're getting more dispersed as well.
Any other kind of final thoughts on the structure? I know I saw a lot of challenges that people typed in earlier around technology and stuff. Obviously, there's lots of options out there. To me, that doesn't matter. But what are your thoughts here about other best practices for, you know, capturing processes? Do you prefer, you know, Zoom over GoToMeeting, or an LMS versus a micro learning, or a CRM versus something else? Any of that really matter, or is it just based on results and personal preferences?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And what I'll say is, any answer you give now is immediately out of date by the time you've said it.
Right.
That's just the nature of these things. At the moment, if you ask me, I love using Zoom. But I love using Zoom at the moment. 18 months ago, I used Skype, and someone Skyped me recently, and I was like, oh, Skype, I remember Skype. Now Skype's old hat to me, you know? Yeah. Internally in our company, we use, I think, Microsoft Teams. I love Teams for internal stuff, but externally is maybe not so good. So the technology is always going to change. And one thing I would say is that's not going to change is, although the players will change, the structure isn't. You're always going to have an archiving system. Now, you can be as simple as, well, SharePoint's not simple. You can have SharePoint, which is fantastic. You can have Dropbox, which I totally love Dropbox. The organizations tend to have their own ways of doing these things, so don't reinvent the wheel. Use the infrastructure that's there. And I am a world super ninja guru at using other people's conference call systems. I use them all. And I'll be honest, I hate them all, but you've got to use them. There is one thing, you did mention something, and I'll tell you where the best companies in the world are going to. The best companies in the world are going to an idea of taking the idea of having great best practice processes and implementing their CRM, but having them through a virtual playbook. Anyone who's interested enough in the world of sales behavior in an organization has to be aware of this. The world is moving, and it genuinely is moving very quickly to having a integrated playbook into a CRM, so that when I'm a sales guy, I'll give you a real example. Say I'm a sales guy and I've got 4 business units, and one has got an expansion for a new product, one's got a challenge with, and one's got a new pricing structure. And I go into the customer and go, oh yeah, new product, oh, pricing change, oh yeah, right. Now I forget that because I'm a sales guy, which means I'm a beautiful thing, but I'm a bit forgetful. If that isn't immediately accessible on my phone, then I've gone from being a world-class sales guy to a guy that quite can't remember my 5 key questions to ask or my 3 value statements. I've got to have it here, and there's no options for that. And what's happening in here, I don't want to have one source of data over here, a bunch of PDFs, a bunch of PowerPoint presentations. That is no longer acceptable. Your learning isn't just what we train. It comes from your product management people too. So you've got to pull all this stuff together and have an integrated playbook. And all of us in the next 5 to 10 years will all have integrated electronic playbooks linked into our CRM. So when the product managers want to launch a new thing, or they want to have a price increase, or whatever's going to happen, if it's not in that CRM and if it's not delivered to your sales team immediately and consistently through your CRM, you can through a playbook on your cell phone, you've got only to blame it yourself. So that's definitely where we're going in here.
Totally agree, and we've been working hard on that for the last couple of years here at Sandler, trying to get ahead of the curve there. So I will say, talk to your Sandler trainer if you want to know about technologies. We have a Sandler Playmaker that's embedded into Salesforce.com. We have a virtual playbook platform. We just released a new My Sandler app that's on Apple and Android devices. And if you're a large corporate account and you wanted to put your contact or your content into our app and use that for your salespeople privately, that's also an option. So you can talk to your Sandler trainer about that. And there's special information on that landing page about our new My Sandler app that you can just download and start playing with it and see how we're distributing the Sandler best practices throughout the world to salespeople on their phones. But I wanted to ask you, Bill, one more question here, and everybody from the audience. You can type in the chat now. How can you use this WALT structure to help during this current remote work crisis? It sounds like it's a great structure, Bill, but I'm wondering, like, does any of that change based on the environment we're in, or is it simple enough that we can implement this right away in stages, since we weren't necessarily planning on everybody being at home this week? How does the current crisis affect what we've been talking about?
It's an excellent question. One thing to think of is, I mean, a crisis this is a very abnormal time for us. And we've got to think, well, okay, but the world doesn't stop turning. The same dynamics are at play. And let me get a great example. I'll tell you what we're doing with most of our clients right now. And I would say, not all, but I would say most of our clients. We're running WALTs. We're running work-aligned learning methods right now on client retention during a crisis. That's what we're doing right now. That's our focus. And they all work exactly the same way. We have a lovely kickoff with a senior leader saying, here's where we are. Now, the goal, the deliverable of that is we've got to move salespeople from being reactive and responsive to being proactive and taking control, because that's our job. So we're using exactly the same WALT structure, all 7 steps of the WALT structure for client retention during a crisis. Because everything that happens in a normal sales time, having a plan, working to the plan, strong communication, putting yourself in a position of trusted advisor. Gosh, that's even more important now than it was 6 months ago. And this, one of the things that we'll say all the time during a crisis is there's 3 phases. What you do now will define what's going to happen in 6 months and a year. They will remember this. So a WALT structure during wartime is super important. Now, obviously, we can't come together in classrooms. Well, that's okay. We've just speeded up the process that was happening anyway. But we can do all this, and we've experience in doing this. We know how to do it. And if you want to know how to do it now, look at the little structure we've sent. We've got it there. We also have a white paper, which I think people can get hold of as well. And all this information, we're giving it to the market, how to do it. The smart thing to do is maybe to ask people who've done it before. It's kind of like us, and we'll give you some help and advice on it. But the walk structure specifically works during a time of crisis. And think to yourself, your people will always remember these months. They'll always remember this. We'll all say, "Oh, that was the virus year, or that was the coronavirus year, whatever it is," and we'll remember this period, how we came through it. And this is a time to train your people. So invest in them, get them working.
Well, that's huge, because I think you said two things there. One is some of the biggest challenges in making learning stick is tying it to something else that's memorable. And you have that chance now that they go, "Oh yeah, remember during the crisis, we learned about account management technique here." They're never going to forget that. This is an anchor memory for the rest of their life. And the other thing you said is, when you invest in down markets, in troubling times, you come out the other side like a slingshot. If you stop training, you stop investing in your people, they notice, they start freaking out and leaving, and you come out way behind your competition when we get back to normalization. So I wanted to run down 5 quick tips for everybody to put this into play, and then we'll give you a call to action. Number 1 is identify your top priorities. We've talked about some of them. Maybe it's client retention right now and playing defense. Maybe you have some opportunities. Maybe it is leadership, where you need people to step up instead of being cogs in the machine and doing the process the way it always was. They need creativity or something else. Any other top priorities you think right now, Bill?
I think one of the top priorities right now is, it's a kind of, we mentioned behavior, attitude, technique. Getting sales guys away from being defensive, getting them proactive right now. That's mine. If I was a sales leader, that's my number 1 priority. Get them back in charge.
That's awesome. Step number 2, select the team and the tools that you're training. We can't design training for everybody. That doesn't work. We got to be very specific about who we're training, what the training is for, what we're hoping they'll accomplish, and kind of where they're starting. Otherwise, we don't know what we're trying to do. I think that also goes into the tools discussion we've been talking about. Any quick tips here?
Just one little thing in here. Whoever you think is on your team, you're probably thinking too small. If you think of traditional sales training, I completely love it, but all sales training should be pulling in people like product management, service delivery, engineers, people like that. Spread it a little bit, which is especially easy with remote learning. Bring some of the adjacent team in.
You remind me of another thing, which is also just communicate this training out to people, because I've seen a lot of times they didn't tell the rest of the company that they were doing training on the crisis thing, and they're like, "Oh, all those talk tracks would have been great for customer service too, that you just shared with sales." So communicate that. Here's a quick list, and I know I'm speeding up here because we're down to the last few minutes, but take a screenshot of this one or check the recording. There's all kinds of different tools. You don't just have to do live face-to-face training. In 2020, you can do recall quizzes, you can do virtual things, online. Bill mentioned the video trips earlier, all kinds of cool tools at your fingertips, which means step 3 is create that implementation plan. Put together your Walt learning thread, figure out which of those tools and when they're most appropriate so that you can get people to recall the information, practice and role play and reinforce that over time. Number 4, design that schedule and time frame so that you get the top priorities in the right order. We're spacing out the reinforcement. We're not trying to cram learning all down everybody's throat in 2 days. You notice that learning thread was over a 2 or 3 month period. So make sure you get the right information in the right order, but design that into a learning schedule that allows people to absorb the information, process it, apply it in their world, and then come back and ask questions. And finally, step number 4 here, evaluate your criteria and your success. Get 360 feedback, look at those key performance indicators, and most importantly for me, collect lessons learned and celebrate successes. Because when you can say, my learners did this, said this, accomplished this, that will go a long way towards that leadership buy-in. Any other final thoughts here, Bill?
For me, the biggest thing in here is to what goal is this learning directed? And that's why the evaluation criteria is there. You've got to hit or not hit. So that's important to me, which is that this last point is so important. Define a win. You've got to give your people, especially at the time of crisis, a goal they can hit.
Absolutely. I love that. People need to know what to do, right? In the crisis, they just want to know what action they can take. That's why we're all out of toilet paper right now, is because people thought that was within their control and other people were doing it. And so they followed along. If you can give your sales team or the rest of your company the right thing to do and something that they can control, they can take action on it. So we want you to share your lessons learned with us. We'd love to hear feedback from you about the webinar today. And a special thank you for attending. Go to sandler.com/remote selling. Sandler.com/remote selling. You'll see a landing page which has information on some of our sales micro learning collections that you can invest in for yourself or your team. They make great drips to do a ongoing reinforcement program. We also have the new My Sandler app and the Alexa skill. You can just ask any Alexa device to enable My Sandler, and you can start asking tough sales questions of Alexa, and she will share answers from our top Sandler trainers and best content from around the world. And of course, as always, you can connect with a Sandler trainer to learn more. Bill, you're on our international sales team. I think that's a great way for us to end. If somebody said, man, I would love to have Bill put together a plan for our team, what would they do? Where would you recommend that they start?
Just, you'll find us on Sandler.com. We're a global organization. We're the world's largest sales training organization. You've got to get that one in. Just go to Sandler.com, tell us where you are, tell us what you want to do, and we'll help if we can.
And just tell me a little bit more about that process too. We don't really sell training off the shelf, although we do have some products and some courses that people could buy. You're talking about you'll walk them through a process to.
Oh, very simple. Well, I mean, there's no such thing as off-the-shelf Sandler training. I'll give you a good example. One that happened today. We had an organization who are based partly in Germany, partly in Norway, and partly in Switzerland. So it's very common to have that kind of split in Europe. And they went into Sandler.com, logical thing to do. Ended up they called our head office in Baltimore, which I would do that too, call head office. So they spoke to our super excellent admin person, Ashley, and Ashley didn't just transfer a call. Ashley's a highly trained professional. She talked them through, what are you trying to achieve? I don't understand. And so she had a good conversation with them. She got a great page of data about our organization, so what they're trying to achieve and what their situation is. Then we as a team say, well, how do we handle that? And then we'll then pick it up from Ashley, and then we'll all do clever stuff. And as it has, I'm going to be calling, got a call lined up, and then we'll have another conversation. And if we can help, we'll start mapping out options for the client. If we can't help, we'll tell them super fast. But the big thing is we'll give the client options straight away.
I love that. And, it probably goes without saying to most of this audience, but Sandler is not about high pressure things. This is about seeing if there's a fit in some way that we could help. So just reach out, have the conversation. If you want to learn more, there's thousands of other resources. You can learn more about our methodology. Just go to sandler.com/remote selling. We hope you found this webinar valuable in developing a virtual training program for your team. This is part 2 of a 4-part series. So if you missed selling remotely, or you would like to hear more information about selling in the crisis or leading during times of rapid change, make sure you go to sandler.com and check out our webinar section to sign up for the rest in this series. Or if you're watching this later, check out those recordings in Sandler Online. Thanks for being here, everybody. Good luck and good selling.